The year 1177. A barren hilltop called Montgisard, sitting lonely in the scorched heart of the Holy Land. The air tastes like copper and dust. Across the endless plains of Ramla, tens of thousands of war banners snap in the wind like a storm made of silk and steel. And riding towards certain death, a teenager, fragile, dying, his flesh rotting beneath bandages, barely strong enough to grip his reins, let alone a sword. His name was Baldwin IV, the leper king of Jerusalem, just 16 years old, afflicted by a disease that was eating him alive. Yet somehow he was the only thing standing between his kingdom and total annihilation. On the other side, Saladin, the sultan who had united the entire Islamic world under one banner, 25,000 warriors, battle-hardened, unstoppable, marching north with one mission: wipe the Crusaders off the map and reclaim Jerusalem forever. The math was brutal, one sick boy leading a few hundred men against an empire. But here's the thing about impossible odds: they only matter until someone refuses to believe them. What happened that day at Montgisard wasn't just a battle. It was a collision between faith and fury, between a dying king and a destiny no one saw coming. And by the time the sun dipped below the desert horizon, the world would witness something it could barely explain. Let's rewind to the winter of 1177. The Holy Land wasn't just unstable, it was falling apart at the seams. For years, fragile ceasefires had kept the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem and the surrounding Muslim territories from tearing each other apart. But that delicate peace, it was crumbling fast. Enter Saladin, not just a military genius, a visionary. He'd spent the last decade doing what many thought impossible, unifying Egypt, Syria, and the fractured Muslim states into a single, unstoppable force. His reputation, legendary, his purpose, crystal clear. Take back Jerusalem, the city stolen by Crusaders nearly 80 years earlier. To him and to millions of Muslims, this wasn't just politics, it was sacred duty. Meanwhile, up north in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, things looked grim. King Baldwin IV had recently been crowned, 16 years old. Brilliant, yes, fluent in multiple languages, sharp as a blade, but also dying slowly, painfully. Leprosy was devouring his body from the inside out, his fingers, his face, his future. And the kingdom he ruled, fractured, broke, weak. The nobles fought amongst themselves over scraps of land and titles. The army was stretched thin, the treasury empty, and Europe, the same Europe that once sent crusading armies by the shipload, had moved on. No reinforcements were coming. Border towns burned, pilgrims were slaughtered on the roads, and then the reports started flooding in, a massive army moving through the Sinai. So large, scouts said, it looked like the desert itself had come alive. That army belonged to Saladin. In early November, he crossed into Crusader territory with tens of thousands of soldiers, cavalry, archers, siege engineers. His plan was ruthless and efficient: strike hard, strike fast, burn their cities, and march on Jerusalem before winter ended. To Saladin, this was the perfect moment. Jerusalem was vulnerable, its king was sick, its allies were gone. If he moved quickly, the holy city would fall before Europe even knew what happened. Inside the palace, Baldwin's advisors panicked. Some begged him to lock down Jerusalem and wait behind the walls. Others argued to abandon the outer territories entirely and protect only the city itself. But Baldwin saw through the fog of fear. If they hid, Saladin would surround them, starve them, crush them. Waiting wasn't strategy, it was surrender. The only chance, however slim, was to do the unthinkable: ride out and meet Saladin head-on before he even realized the king of Jerusalem was coming for him. So the dying boy made a decision that would alter the fate of an entire civilization. He would take every knight he could muster, march south, and gamble everything on one desperate move. The decision was made, there was no turning back. If Jerusalem stayed locked behind its walls, the city would fall. Saladin's army was too close, too massive, too confident, but there was one place that could still change the game. Ascalon, a fortress city perched on the southern coast, guarding the invasion route into the kingdom. If Baldwin could get there first, he could block Saladin's advance, regroup his forces, and strike from a fortified position. If he failed, the road to Jerusalem would be wide open. That's why speed was everything. The night before departure, the palace buzzed with anxious energy. Servants darted through corridors with urgent messages. Priests whispered prayers in shadowed corners. Rain hammered the stone rooftops like a drumbeat of fate. Baldwin sat alone in a dimly lit chamber, hands trembling beneath white linen wraps. The pain was relentless, leprosy gnawing at his nerves, but his mind stayed razor-sharp. He summoned his generals. When they arrived, drenched and silent, the young king looked up and spoke in a calm, unwavering voice. "We leave for Ascalon at dawn. If Saladin reaches it before us, there will be no Jerusalem left to defend." No one questioned him, they simply bowed. Through the night, riders galloped out from the city, carrying urgent orders to every loyal commander still standing. Knights from Ramla, soldiers from Gaza, and a message to the Templar garrison stationed at Ascalon's fortress: "Hold the gates, the king is coming." Before sunrise, Jerusalem awoke to the sound of war preparations. Rain clouds hung heavy and low, torchlight flickered off wet cobblestones, Crowds gathered along the walls, watching their king prepare to ride out. He looked impossibly fragile, pale, wrapped in armor too heavy for his withering frame, but there was something unshakable in the way he held himself. Beside him rode priests carrying the true cross, mounted on a golden staff that seemed to glow even in the grey dawn. As they passed through the city gate, Baldwin turned to his men and said quietly, "The walls of Jerusalem stand because we do." Then he spurred his horse forward. The army began its march south. The road to Ascalon was brutal. Rain returned by midday, transforming the dirt roads into rivers of black mud. Horses stumbled, wagons shattered, men trudged knee-deep through water, armor dragging them down like anchors. But no one stopped. Every mile mattered, every hour counted. In the villages they passed, farmers stood silently by the road. Some handed out bread, others crossed themselves. They knew where the king was going and what was waiting for him there. At night the army camped in soaked tents. Baldwin slept little. Instead, he moved among his men, checking wounds, sharing rations, speaking words of quiet strength to soldiers who could barely lift their heads. To them, he was no longer just a ruler. He was proof that courage didn't require a perfect body. By the third day, they reached the coast. Wind roared across the plains, carrying the sharp smell of salt and seaweed, and there, rising through the haze on the horizon, the towers of Ascalon. Its ancient walls, built by crusaders decades earlier, stood strong against the grey waves of the Mediterranean. Baldwin smiled for the first time in days. They'd made it. The Templars opened the gates as the royal banners came into view. Only about 100 knights remained in the garrison, but their discipline was legendary. When they saw the king dismount, moving stiffly but standing upright, they knelt. Inside the fortress chapel, maps were spread across tables, candles flickered. Baldwin's voice was hoarse but steady. "Saladin thinks we're trapped in Jerusalem. He won't expect us here. We ride at dawn, intercept him near Montgisard, and strike while his forces are scattered." The Templar commander frowned. "Your Majesty, his army is vast. If we fail..." Baldwin gently cut him off. "If we fail, there will be nothing left to protect." Silence filled the room, only the rain tapping against stained glass. Finally, the Templar commander placed his fist over his heart. "Then we ride with you, my king." Outside, the fortress erupted with activity. Armor clanged, horses were fed and saddled, men whispered prayers as priests blessed them with holy water. Some wrote final letters home, knowing they might never return. Others simply stared eastward, where the clouds were breaking and the sun began to bleed through. When dawn arrived, Baldwin stood before his men. The sea wind tore at his cloak. The golden cross behind him glowed in the rising light. He raised one trembling hand and pointed toward the horizon. "Montgisard," he said, "ride with me." As the gates swung open, the thunder of 100 hooves shattered the silence. The army of a dying king rode into legend. They left Ascalon before sunrise. Cold wind swept in from the sea, carrying the scent of salt and iron. Armor clinked softly in the half-light. The rhythm of hooves echoed off the fortress walls. The men rode in silence. No songs, no chatter, just the steady beat of horses and whispered prayers. King Baldwin rode at the front. Beside him, priests carried the true cross mounted high on a golden staff that caught the first rays of dawn. Behind them came the Templars, a few hundred knights in black and white cloaks, eyes locked on the road ahead. It wasn't a large army, it was faith written in steel. Their destination, Montgisard, a small rocky hill between Ramla and Lydda. From there, they could cut across the flat coastal plain and strike Saladin's forces while they were still spread thin. The location was chosen carefully. Its slopes offered cover from arrows, its open ground was perfect for a charge, and its narrow valley would trap a scattered enemy. It was gambler's terrain, a place where faith might outweigh numbers. The march was punishing. Rain returned before noon, drenching men and horses. Mud sucked at boots. Spears sank into the ground with every step. But no one turned back. By midday, scouts returned with news. They'd found Saladin's army, but what they saw wasn't order. It was chaos. The Sultan's force was massive, over 25,000 strong, but it had grown reckless. Believing the Crusaders were trapped behind Jerusalem's walls, Saladin had allowed his troops to spread out across the countryside. Columns drifted miles apart, banners scattered like leaves in the wind, cavalry hunted for supplies, infantry wandered through fields and orchards, looting villages and setting homes ablaze. Drums still beat somewhere in the distance, but the rhythm of discipline was gone. Arrogance had replaced order. Baldwin's scouts watched from afar, the smoke of burning houses, the sounds of laughter and shouting. Saladin's men were celebrating victory before the battle had even begun. When the news reached Baldwin, he felt the moment crystallize. He turned to his captains. "This is our chance, strike before they remember who they are." The army halted near a low rise, the hill of Montgisard. Baldwin surveyed the field. To the east, the enemy camp lay scattered across the open plain. To the west, the faint shimmer of the sea. He pointed toward the ridge. "We wait there. The Lord has handed them their pride. Now we take their army." The men moved quietly into position. Templars formed the center, knights on the wings, infantry behind. The priests planted the true cross in the earth, its golden edges glinting through the mist. Some men knelt, others stared, breathing hard, hearts pounding beneath armor. Across the valley, the first shapes of Saladin's forces began to gather, confused soldiers scrambling to reform their lines. But it was too late. Baldwin had already drawn his sword. "Now," he said. The horns sounded, one deep, unbroken note, and the plain erupted. Hundreds of armored horses thundered down the slope, hooves drumming like a storm, lances lowered, sunlight flashed on steel. The battle cry rose through the valley, "Deus vult, God wills it." The charge hit Saladin's front ranks like a wave of iron. Men screamed, shields splintered, horses crashed. The Templars tore through the first line, ripping a hole straight into the heart of the Muslim camp. Baldwin rode behind them, the true cross beside him, his cloak whipping through dust and smoke. Arrows blackened the sky, several knights fell, but the rest pressed on, pushing deeper, shouting above the chaos. Saladin's officers tried desperately to regroup, waving banners, shouting orders, but their commands vanished in the roar of battle. Their men were too scattered, too busy looting, too far from discipline to respond. The hill trembled beneath the fighting, swords clanged, shields shattered, sand turned red. Baldwin leaned forward, coughing blood, whispering through the pain, "Hold the cross, hold it high." The priest lifted it higher. Sunlight caught the golden frame again, blazing above the smoke like a flame. Seeing it, the crusaders rallied. Their shouts rose over the wind. Faith replaced fear, momentum became fury. From a nearby ridge, Saladin watched the disaster unfold. He rode to his guards, shouting orders, waving his curved saber, "Reform, turn them, circle the flanks." But his words were swallowed by the storm. His cavalry hesitated, the lines broke again. The battlefield that had been his pride became his prison. Then Baldwin saw the green banner of the Sultan through the haze. He raised his sword and pointed, "There with me." The Templars followed, a narrow spear of steel cutting through the center. They slammed into Saladin's personal guard with terrifying force. The banner wavered, then fell. Saladin's horse went down, struck by an arrow. His men dragged him from the chaos, forcing him to flee. What began as an invasion turned into a rout. Thousands threw down their weapons and ran. Those who looked back saw the boy king's banner still standing, golden in the dying light. When the sun set over Montgisard, the plain lay silent. Twisted armor lay scattered among the bodies, banners torn, fires dying in the wind. Baldwin sat motionless on his horse, too weak to lift his sword. Around him, soldiers stared, exhausted, stunned, unable to speak. They had just done the impossible. Night fell slowly over Montgisard. The fires burned low, flickering across the broken plain. The air smelled of smoke, blood, and the distant sea. Everywhere lay the ruins of an army that had believed itself invincible. Saladin fled south through the darkness. His once proud host was shattered, thousands dead, thousands more scattered across the desert. He rode in silence, surrounded by a handful of guards, his robe torn, his armor dented and blackened with dust. No drums, no banners, no songs, just the hollow echo of hooves through the empty land. When he reached Gaza 2 days later, the desert wind blew cold through his camp. He ordered silence, no speeches, no celebrations, no prayers of victory. He had learned something that day. The smallest enemy, when driven by faith, could break even the mightiest force. His pride was gone, in its place, respect. "Never again," he said to his officers, "never again will I underestimate that boy." Back at Montgisard, Baldwin's army spent the night among the dead. The wounded were carried to makeshift tents. Priests moved between them, whispering prayers. Some knights sat in the mud beside fallen brothers, holding their hands until the end. Others stared blankly into the dark, unable to understand how they were still alive. Baldwin lay under canvas shelter, his face pale, his breathing shallow. The pain of his illness had worsened, but he refused to rest. He asked for only one thing, the true cross. They brought it to him. He reached out with bandaged hands and touched the golden frame, his lips trembling. "Not by strength," he whispered, "but by faith." At dawn, the surviving soldiers gathered on the hill. The wind was gentle now, carrying the smell of the sea. They buried the dead, friend and foe alike, under piles of stone. There was no hatred, only exhaustion, and a strange, quiet peace. When the sun rose, the boy king appeared again. He could barely stand, but he climbed the hill, leaning on his sword. The men watched in silence as he reached the top, the true cross behind him catching the light. He looked out over the plain where the battle had raged. Then he turned to his army and said simply, "Jerusalem still stands." No cheers followed, only the sound of men weeping quietly, armor clinking as they knelt. 3 days later, Baldwin entered Jerusalem through the same gate he had left. The people lined the streets, old men, mothers, children, all staring in disbelief. They had expected ruin. Instead, they saw their king return alive. Not as a conqueror, as a miracle. Priests rang the church bells until the metal cracked, the air filled with tears and hymns. Baldwin dismounted slowly, his legs trembling. He raised his hand to bless the crowd, his voice barely a whisper. The Lord was with us, and as long as we believe, he will be with us still. But that night, in the quiet of the palace, Baldwin sat alone. The cheers outside faded. He looked down at his hands, skin broken, fingers curled and stiff. He knew his illness would never heal. He knew his time was short. And yet, for that single day at Montgisard, he had been more than a king, more than a victim of fate. He had been the sword of his people and the shield of his God. The battle had ended, but the story had just begun. News of Montgisard spread faster than wildfire. Across the Holy Land, men who had expected disaster now spoke of miracles. Merchants in Acre, pilgrims in Jaffa, soldiers in the hills, all told the same story, how a dying boy had shattered the army of Saladin. In the great cities of the Muslim world, disbelief turned to silence. In Cairo, poets wrote of fate and humility. In Damascus, soldiers whispered that God had turned his face for just one day. Even Saladin himself ordered prayers, not of victory but of survival. For the Crusaders, Montgisard changed everything. The shadow of fear that had hung over Jerusalem lifted, if only for a moment. Baldwin became more than a king. He became a symbol, not of power but of endurance. He had fought not with strength but with faith. And faith, for once, had won. Yet those who saw him after the triumph noticed something else. The boy king smiled rarely. He spoke softly, as if already listening to another voice, one that called beyond glory, beyond pain, toward something eternal. Montgisard wasn't the end of war, but it was proof that even in a dying body, the will of a nation can live. And long after the fires of battle burned out, the wind of Montgisard carried a single story. Of a sick king, a forgotten army, and the day pride was swallowed by faith.